What if the fate of one of history's most brilliant and most dangerous generals was decided not on a battlefield, but in a quiet conversation between two men who would both become President of the United States? What if the question of whether George S. Patton could ever truly be trusted again came down to a single, honest exchange between Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower, two men who understood war, power, and human nature at a level most people will never comprehend? This is not a story about tanks or battlefields. This is a story about loyalty, ego, genius, political survival, and the ruthless calculus of command that determines which men rise to glory and which men are quietly set aside, no matter how brilliant they are. The answer Truman gave Eisenhower reveals something profound about how power really works, and why even the greatest warriors in history are ultimately servants of something larger than themselves. If this kind of deep, untold history is what you live for, then subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know before, because this story is just getting started and it only gets more intense from here. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was in its final, thunderous convulsions. The Allied armies were pushing deep into Germany, and at the tip of the American spear was General George Smith Patton, Jr., commanding the Third Army with a ferocity and brilliance that had become the stuff of legend. In just over 9 months since the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Patton's Third Army had liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, and advanced farther and faster than any army in American military history. From the hedgerows of France to the frozen hills of Luxembourg during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Patton had performed miracles. He had turned his entire army 90 degrees in brutal winter conditions and driven north to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne in less than 72 hours, an operational feat that military historians still study with astonishment. He was, without question, the most feared American combat commander on the Western Front. And yet, even at the peak of his military glory, the shadow of his own character followed him like a storm cloud that never quite moved on. The tension between Patton's extraordinary ability and his catastrophic lack of self-control had been a defining feature of his career long before the final campaigns in Germany. In August 1943, during the Sicily campaign, Patton had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from battle fatigue at field hospitals. First Private Charles Cole on August 3 at the 15th Evacuation Hospital, and then Private Paul Bennett on August 10 at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. When the incidents became public in late November 1943, the scandal nearly ended his career. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, was furious, not merely at the act itself, but at the impossible position it placed him in. Eisenhower needed Patton. The Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Wehrmacht High Command tracked Patton's movements obsessively, convinced that wherever Patton appeared, the main Allied offensive would follow. That fear was so powerful and so useful that Patton was deliberately used as a deception tool before D-Day, placed in command of the fictional 1st United States Army Group, known as FUSAG, to convince German intelligence that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The deception worked brilliantly. And yet the man at the center of it all remained a walking contradiction, a warrior of unparalleled skill and a liability of unpredictable proportion. Eisenhower's relationship with Patton stretched back decades, shaped by mutual respect, genuine admiration, and a persistent undercurrent of frustration. They had known each other since the early 1920s, when both were still relatively junior officers navigating the slow, peacetime army that offered little glory and even less advancement. Eisenhower had always recognized that Patton possessed something rare, an almost mystical connection to the art of war, a sense for the battlefield that could not be taught, only born. But Eisenhower also knew, perhaps better than anyone, that Patton's genius came inseparably bundled with his recklessness, his vanity, his volcanic temper, and his almost childlike inability to grasp the political dimensions of modern warfare. After the slapping incidents, Eisenhower had written Patton a letter of severe reprimand, dated August 17, 1943, warning him in the clearest possible terms that any repetition of such behavior would result in his relief from command. Patton had stood before his superior, a man 11 years his junior, and apologized with what witnesses described as genuine remorse. Eisenhower had kept him, and Patton had delivered. The invasion of Sicily concluded successfully. The deception plan before Normandy succeeded magnificently. And then the Third Army's campaign across France and into Germany became one of the greatest sustained offensive operations in the history of warfare. For a brief, blazing moment in 1945, It seemed as though Patton had finally found the discipline to match his genius. But the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and with it ended the one environment in which George Patton truly made sense. In the weeks and months that followed VE Day, Patton found himself in an impossible situation. He was a man of war asked to govern in peacetime, a conqueror required to administer rather than advance. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria, responsible for overseeing the denazification of one of the most politically sensitive regions in post-war Germany. And almost immediately, he began to fail in ways that were as predictable as they were catastrophic. Patton was dismissive of denazification efforts, viewing former Nazi Party members as merely efficient administrators who could help restore order. In a press conference on September 22, 1945, he made remarks comparing the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties back home, comments so politically explosive that they sent shockwaves through Washington and across the Allied world. He also made statements suggesting that the United States should consider rearming German forces to confront the Soviet Union, remarks that directly contradicted official Allied policy at a moment of extreme diplomatic sensitivity. Eisenhower, now commanding all U.S. forces in Europe from his headquarters in Frankfurt, received the reports with a weariness that went beyond professional frustration. This was not a commander losing his grip under pressure. This was a man constitutionally incapable of functioning in the world that victory had created. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. It was not done harshly. Eisenhower offered Patton command of the 15th Army, a largely administrative unit responsible for compiling the official history of the European campaign. It was, in every meaningful sense, a retirement wrapped in the language of reassignment. Patton accepted it with bitterness he barely concealed. In his diary entries from that period, he wrote with raw candor about his belief that he was being sacrificed to political forces he despised, that his honesty was being punished while mediocrity was rewarded, and that the America he had given his life to serve was retreating from the hard truths that victory demanded. He spoke privately of resigning his commission entirely, of returning home and speaking openly about what he believed were catastrophic mistakes being made in the occupation of Germany. His friends worried. His staff worried. Even those who had clashed with him throughout the war found something genuinely heartbreaking in watching this titan of the battlefield reduced to shuffling papers in a quiet headquarters while the world moved on without him. Then, on December 9, 1945, fate delivered its final judgment in the most mundane of forms. On a road outside Mannheim, Germany, a U.S. Army truck collided with the staff car carrying Patton. He suffered a severe spinal injury. He lingered for 12 days in a military hospital in Heidelberg. On December 21, 1945, George Smith Patton Jr. died. He was 60 years old. Now, if you are still watching, and the fact that you are tells us something important about you, this is exactly the moment to pause and show this channel some love. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, hit the like button, share this video with someone in your life who appreciates real, unfiltered history, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most so far. Your engagement keeps this kind of serious, deeply researched storytelling alive, and there is still a great deal more to uncover about what happened after Patton was gone, and what was said about him by the two men who would define American power for the next decade. Harry S. Truman became President of the United States on April 12, 1945, following the sudden death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He had met Patton only briefly during the war, but he was keenly aware of the general's reputation, both the heroic and the scandalous dimensions of it. Truman himself was a man of directness, practicality, and a deeply personal sense of military honor rooted in his own service as an artillery captain in France during World War I. He had no patience for theatrical generals who prioritized their own legend above the needs of their country. And yet Truman was also a man capable of profound appreciation for genuine military talent when it served the national interest. When Eisenhower returned to Washington in the summer of 1945 as the supreme hero of the European war, welcomed by massive parades in cities across America, the question of what would become of the Army's greatest warriors was very much on the minds of those in power. Eisenhower was clearly destined for a political future. The speculation about a presidential run had already begun. Patton, before his death, had represented a different kind of question entirely. What do you do with a weapon so powerful and so unstable that wielding it always risks destroying the hand that holds it? The conversation that history remembers, or more precisely, the conversation that has been reconstructed through letters, memoirs, and the testimonies of those close to both men, centered on a question that Eisenhower himself had wrestled with throughout the final years of the war. Had Patton changed enough to be trusted in the post-war world? Was there a version of George Patton that could function in an environment defined by diplomacy, political sensitivity, and institutional restraint rather than by the raw imperatives of combat? Truman's answer, as those who knew him have recorded, was characteristically blunt. He respected what Patton had done on the battlefield. No honest assessment of the European war could deny it. But Truman had also watched Patton's performance in Bavaria with deep concern, had read the reports of his statements about the Nazis and the Soviets, and had reached a conclusion that had nothing to do with personal animosity and everything to do with institutional reality. A man who could not distinguish between winning a battle and winning the peace, Truman believed, was a man whose usefulness had reached its natural limit. The slapping incidents, the Fusag deception, the spectacular campaigns of 1944 and 1945, the disasters in Bavaria, all of it pointed to the same fundamental truth about Patton: he was a creature of absolute war, and absolute war was over. What makes this exchange historically significant is not merely what was said about Patton, but what it revealed about the nature of leadership in the modern world. Eisenhower, who had managed Patton's genius and Patton's chaos for years, understood that the qualities that made Patton irreplaceable in combat, his aggression, his contempt for caution, his absolute refusal to accept limitations, were the same qualities that made him ungovernable in any other context. The army and the nation had needed Patton the warrior. They had no use for Patton the diplomat, Patton the administrator, Patton the peacetime commander, because no such person truly existed. What existed was a man who had forged his entire identity around the act of war, who had studied it, dreamed of it, believed himself reincarnated through history's great battles, and who was simply, constitutionally, unable to become something else. Truman understood this not as a condemnation but as a recognition of reality. Great men, he believed, were shaped by the times that demanded them. When those times passed, the greatness did not always transfer. It was, in its own way, one of the most honest and sobering assessments of military genius that any American president ever offered. The legacy of this moment extends far beyond the careers of the men involved. It touches on a question that every generation of leaders must confront. How do you honor extraordinary service while acknowledging its limits? How do you respect a man's contributions to history while accepting that the world he helped create has no place for him? Patton himself, in his more reflective moments, seemed to sense this. His diary entries in the final months of his life are filled with a melancholy that contrasts sharply with the fire of his public persona. He wrote of feeling like a man out of time, like a relic from an age that the modern world was determined to forget as quickly as possible. He had given everything, his health, his reputation, his peace of mind, to a cause that had now moved beyond him. Eisenhower would go on to become Supreme Commander of NATO in 1951 and President of the United States in January 1953. Truman would navigate the opening years of the Cold War, make the decision to use atomic weapons, and lead America through the Korean War. The world they built was shaped in part by the battles Patton had won for them. But it was also, deliberately and necessarily, a world built without him. George Patton was buried on December 24, 1945, at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army he had led with such ferocious devotion. He had specifically requested to be buried with his men rather than return to the United States, and that final wish was honored. The grave is simple, dignified, and strangely moving for anyone who knows the story of the man who lies there. And in a very real sense, what Truman said to Eisenhower about Patton, that judgment delivered in the quiet language of honest men, stands as the most fitting epitaph for a warrior who was magnificent precisely because he could never be anything else. History does not always reward the greatest with the gentlest endings. Sometimes it simply uses them completely, wrings every last measure of their greatness onto the stage of the world, and then moves on. Patton burned at a temperature the world could only sustain for so long. But while he burned, nothing could stop him. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know before, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who deserves to hear it, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most about Patton, Eisenhower, or Truman. Your voice in the comments matters, and stories like this one deserve to be heard by as many people as possible.